Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Red Review, a Socialist Action Canada podcast giving you a retrospective on this month in Canadian and international politics. My name is Emily, and I'm a new host for you this month. I hope I will be a welcome addition to your listening experience. I am based in Guelph, Ontario, which is the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty.
And coming back this month, I'm Daniel from Toronto, or so-called Toronto. Emily and I are both members of Socialist Action, and we're ready for what is, again, a very newsworthy month in Canadian history. We have so many things to unpack here, socialists.
So many things to unpack. Yeah, I'm often reminded of that Lenin quote, which often gets tossed around of, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And I feel like this past year has been, I feel like I've aged 100 years. I don't know about you.
Absolutely. I actually like the retelling of Lenin's quote. There are decades where you fuck around and there are weeks where you find out.
Indeed, indeed. And there has been a lot of finding out, both on an international and local scale. We are going to be talking today about a lot of different things that have been happening both near to us in Ontario, across Canada, or so-called Canada, and around the world at the intervention of Canadian imperialism and its allies in the United States. We're talking about the climate crisis, we're talking about police brutality, we're talking about encampment evictions, and we're talking about Canadian imperialism in Cuba, in Palestine, and in Haiti.
And on the topic of Haiti, this month we're really excited to interview activist and author and foreign policy expert Eve Engler, who will be really breaking down for us what is, at least to me, a very confusing situation in Haiti.
And certainly one that is not well covered by the Canadian media. So we are thrilled to be able to interview Eve, ask him all of our questions, and hopefully some of yours as well. And you can also find him at the links in our description. So as we begin this podcast, I do want to acknowledge that all of us who work on this podcast live and work on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island. We recognize that there can be no true reconciliation without restitution, which includes giving land back and seizing the assets of the major resource corporations and returning them to the commons. We also want listeners to have a content warning, as this episode will dive into some heavy topics such as genocide within our colonial borders and abroad, police violence, hate crimes, and apartheid.
And before we begin this Red Review, let's hear again from Comrade Ellen, who will be telling you about our sponsor this month.
Last month we brought you Pan American Silver, a Vancouver-based mining company. This month we thought we'd travel to the other coast and present you with the Irving Empire. We are therefore proud to announce that this podcast is not sponsored by the Irving Empire, a group of companies based out of New Brunswick, worth in excess of $7.38 billion. The Irving Empire started with a family sawmill in Bouctouche, New Brunswick, led by K.C. Irving, and grew by the 1970s into a family dynasty consisting of 3 sons who owned and operated the Irving oil business, construction, engineering, steel fabrication, and significantly, most of the province's newspapers. You won't read the real news in the Irving newspapers, however. This is why we want to highlight the acumen of the Canadian Union of Public Employees in New Brunswick. While the Irving Empire has been doing just fine during the pandemic, frontline workers have been falling behind. CUPE has been deadlocked in negotiations with Blaine Higgs' minority Tory government for months in a bid to get fair wages and conditions for workers. However, as we learn from the New Brunswick Media Co-op, Higgs has been given 100 days or until Labor Day to come up with a fair deal for workers or else face province-wide actions. CUPE is the largest public sector union in Canada with 700,000 members and has 28,000 workers in New Brunswick, so kudos to them. We at Red Review offer our solidarity to all those brave workers in their struggle.
All right, so first up, we have the victory at 1492 Landback Lane. On July 1st, Foxgate Developments cancelled the Mackenzie House development projects near Caledonia, Ontario, after nearly 1 year of land defence from Haudenosaunee land defenders from 6 nations of the Grand River. They renamed the site 1492 Landback Lane. Land defenders persevered despite a permanent court injunction banning them from the site and over $15 million spent on OPP surveillance and terrorism investigations, which targeted both land defenders and the Allies bringing them supplies. The land in question is covered by the Haldeman Proclamation of 1784, where a tract of land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from its mouth to its source, was given to the 6 nations for fighting alongside the British during the American Revolution. Within just 14 years, in 1798, colonizers were settling along the Grand River. Treated as wards of the state, Indian agents brokered the surrender of large portions of the land, which, although immediately disputed by Indigenous chiefs, were enforced by the Crown. As settlement increased, which includes the settlements of Waterloo, Cambridge, Kitchener, and Brantford, hunting and fishing opportunities were decimated, forcing Indigenous peoples to move. The 6 Nations Reserve today represents only 5% of the original land granted to the 6 Nations in 1784.
But Schuyler Williams, who acts as the spokesperson for the group occupying Landback Lane, believes that money is really not the focus of what they're doing there. He says it's more important that the Haudenosaunee people have enough land to live on, and that the 6 Nations Reserve be able to expand just like cities and towns do. Quote, "For us to settle for whittling the Haldeman tract down to dollars and cents, I think that's a huge disrespect to our ancestors who fought and died for this land," end quote. And he also added that he wants this area to stay as natural as possible. And quote, "Progress looks like being able to see the deer sometimes," end quote. And that's what they've been doing there a lot. They've been asking for allies and supporters to bring fruit trees. They're trying to return to a more traditional form of food cultivation and governance. And even though Foxgate canceled this project, the struggle is not over. Haldeman Police Services Board is actually now just intervening and calling for the arrest of Schuyler Williams for supposedly violating the terms of his release when he turned himself over to police a few months back to satisfy the warrant that was out for his arrest related to the 6 charges he faced for his role in the 1492 Landback land defense. It was board chair of this Haldeman Police Services Board who said that by returning to the site later, because that was part of his release conditions that he not go back to 1492 Landback Lane, this board chair, this cop, said that Schuyler Williams was, quote, "thumbing his nose at our court system," end quote. And I'm pretty sure Schuyler responded to that by saying, "Well, I am doing that. I am thumbing my nose at you. I don't respect this at all."
I have no respect for your colonial court, so why would I? Why would I respect your colonial court when you seem invested, $15 million invested in displacing me and my peoples from our land, you know?
No, absolutely. And this is not even the police that has jurisdiction over this area. They're just so upset that it seems like the Indigenous land defenders, in this case, have a momentary victory, at least from the corporation. But the police still are like, nope, that doesn't matter if they canceled it. We are still here.
Yeah, we can't have people getting ideas about, standing up to court injunctions and defending their lands. We would not want people to draw any kind of inspiration from this whatsoever because, what the police say is law. What the police do is held above all else. Which segues a little bit into our next section.
Yeah, right.
So, this is all part of mounting police propaganda and against Indigenous peoples, but also in favor of police and what they do. I remember last month you mentioned the CBC article where they talked about the toll that police shootings is having on police officers, which is just such a bizarre way to phrase it. But in terms of police propaganda, we need to talk about the propaganda of a police funeral. On Monday, July 12th, a funeral was held at the BMO Field in Toronto, Ontario, for police officer Jeffrey Northrop. The funeral was attended by 1,500 police officers and dignitaries, including Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Toronto Mayor John Tory. Detective Constable Northrop was attending a priority call in a parking garage in Queen and Bay area of Toronto in the early hours of July 2nd. And while he was there, he was struck by a vehicle, which, according to the Toronto Police Chief Raymer, police believe was an intentional and deliberate act by the driver of the vehicle. This statement of belief on behalf of the police prior to the full investigation of the incident clearly shows a predetermined assumption of guilt, which was made without further information being provided to support this claim. It also ignores the fact that Northrop and his partner were in plainclothes as part of a policing unit at Toronto City Hall, where memorials and protests were held on July 1st to grieve the discovery of hundreds of dead Indigenous children at residential schools.
Yeah, so that was what he was doing as a police officer. He was undercover at what was more or less a funeral. I was there that day at City Hall, and it was an opportunity for the community to be able to grieve and also to highlight the role that Canada as a state, as a genocidal state, played in the tragedy of all these dead Indigenous children. And so that's who we're supposed to be, I guess, mourning here when he dies. He was responding to a robbery call in plain clothes, and now the police has made a huge spectacle about this. So the alleged driver of the vehicle already is charged with first-degree murder. They appeared in court on July 2nd, later that day, and a publication ban on further reporting of the specifics of the incidents was put in place already. But this was already after the police told everybody this person's guilty, they did it, first-degree murder. So no one else is now allowed to report on what's happening. And even the fact that the police officer was in plain clothes, that often doesn't make its way into the reporting. Yeah. That doesn't seem to be the focus here. It's all just died in the line of duty.
Yeah, I didn't hear that at all. Until I read this, I did not know that he was in plainclothes at the time, nor that he was part of the division who was keeping an eye on things at City Hall during these rallies to support Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island.
Yep, so it's a bit of nonsense, and it's really just an extension of that thin blue line nonsense. You see a lot of it in the States, but it's equally as present on the Canadian side. You have police officers in Canada wearing the Canadian version of the thin blue line while they're on duty. And it's really this idea, the working class, we're just an unruly, unwashed mob, and we apparently need to be surveilled and brutalized just to keep everything running. Without the police, everything would fall apart.
With that all being said, let's instead provide a little bit of context. So between 1961 and 2018, there have been a total of 155 reported homicides of Canadian police officers. 133 of these homicides occurred between 1961 and 2009, of which 128, or 96%, have been solved as of the fall of 2010. As noted in the 2010 Statistics Canada study, taxi cab drivers are twice as likely to be murdered on the job, and there are indeed many, many other public service jobs that are much more deadly than being a police officer.
So in contrast to the 150 or so police officers that were murdered on the job, just between January 6th of 2017 and June 12th of 2020, so just about 3 years, there were a total of 100 Canadians killed by police officers. That's one for every 13 days in that period alone. And this is only the shooting deaths that occurred. Like we made clear last episode, this doesn't include suspicious deaths in police custody, where, again, everything gets covered up and you have no idea what really happened. Of these 100 people killed by police shooting, 38% were Indigenous, and in total, 52% were visible minorities, which generally only represent 27% of the Canadian population. So they're twice as likely to be killed by the police than you would expect just based on population size alone. And as of June 19th of this year, only one of these shootings resulted in criminal charges against the officers involved. 53 resulted in officers being cleared of criminal wrongdoing, and 47 are still under investigation. And we highlighted some of these last month where, in the Ontario, it's the Special Investigations Unit that is charged with investigating this. And it's a lot of former cops who are just basically saying, yep, cops did what cops are supposed to do. Why would we hold them accountable?
Mm-hmm. And for those following along at home, that is a 1% conviction rate for police shooters and a 96% conviction rate for those who are responsible for the deaths of police officers. I think in the context of police propaganda, it is also worth noting that there is a Manitoba MP whose name I completely forget, and we can add that in later in our corrections document. There was a Manitoba MP recently who started a House of Commons petition in favor of banning hate speech against police officers and having slander of police officers be covered under the Canadian laws against hate speech. This is in response to police in Winnipeg facing criticisms for the death of Indigenous teenagers at the hands of police.
I love how that's the response. The response is to silence the legitimate criticism rather than even take a moment to look at the institution of policing and think, does this help anybody really?
It's just despicable. And the way he phrased it was so laughably transparent, saying that it was taxing on the officers' mental health and that it was hard for them to serve in the community when there was so much hatred and suspicion. And it's like, well, if you're having problems building trust with your communities that you're supposedly serving, maybe consider that taking responsibility for when one of your employees is responsible for the death of teenagers.
No, absolutely. It's the first step, but it's so inverted, and we'll talk about it later, but it's a very similar strategy employed around Palestine. If you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. If you criticize cops, some people want it to be considered hate speech because cops are very clearly an equity-seeking group. And we all know that compared to any other job, cops get really treated the worst. They get paid so little, and their pensions are just non-existent. And it's just so hard.
Yeah, they don't take up the vast majority of any city budgets.
No. Oh, my. Meanwhile, taxi cab drivers, we all know, are just super, super well paid and respected in society, and that's why they don't need protection at all. It's really the cops that have been neglected for so long.
Oh my goodness. We're laughing, but it's only because it's so horrifying and you need to laugh through the pain, right?
Sometimes, absolutely. And I just don't, otherwise it's just shock silence. Yeah. And that doesn't convey well on a podcast. It's an audio format. I need something to fill the space.
But anyways, so with all this in mind, Police Chief Raymer's claim at the funeral that, quote, taking an oath to serve and protect our communities is among the highest callings of public service, but putting the safety of others above our own can come at a terrible cost. This is something we accept, but never expect, end quote. This is just not supported by reality. If Canadian police were putting the safety of the public above their own, you might expect some of these statistics to be reversed, or that perhaps police shootings wouldn't exist at all. Instead, we see the Toronto police on the quote-unquote front line of beating and evicting our homeless neighbors and residents of Toronto parks. On July 21st, the Toronto police destroyed tents, used pepper spray, broke bones, gave concussions, and arrested 26 people for resisting the eviction of just 17 homeless people from Lamport Stadium, which is a public park in Toronto. Just the week earlier, Toronto police also cleared the homeless residents of Alexandria Park, just in time for the park to be closed off to the public entirely 2 days later for the filming of a new FX show.
They swear that it's not related.
Oh, no.
You know, employees of the city of Toronto have said, no, this is just some strange coincidence that we prioritized the clearing of this park just before this new, big budget TV show was set to film there. That was just good timing, really. But totally, there's not an internal memo that highlights that we did this specifically so we can keep that sweet TV money coming in.
Well, and it's so callous. It is so callous to say that people are trespassing on public property, that these encampments have been served with trespass notices for being on public property. Is public property only available to those who own private land?
That is a profound question that needs to be asked.
I can't take credit for that statement. I think that was Nora Loretto on Twitter.
Of course. That sounds like a Nora take. It just cuts through it, doesn't it?
It is a very valid question. Is public space only for those who can afford to be on their own property should they so choose? It's somewhat despicable that we don't consider unhoused people to be part of our community, part of our neighbors. This attitude that only people with private property that they can go back to are the only ones that should have access to public space is just ridiculous. And the only way that this makes sense is if your anti-poverty strategy is just hiding people who are living in poverty away from view entirely and condemning them to disappear into the shelter system or disappear into the streets entirely. We need to stand up for our unhoused neighbors wherever and whenever possible.
Absolutely. So that's why we want to make sure everybody's aware in Toronto of the Encampment Support Network and all these other groups that we'll be linking in the description below that are on the front lines resisting this really callous, immoral, but inherently profit-driven move of, as you put so eloquently, essentially disappearing the really abject poverty that is so prevalent in the city, and they're just trying to force these people more and more to the outside. And over the last few years, people have been resisting. People are coming together to literally join hands in front of a line of police officers who then take this as an opportunity to bash some skulls.
Mm-hmm.
I feel some of those police officers really relished the opportunity to be part of that thin blue line as they, destroyed the meager possessions of some of these houseless people who were really forced to have to camp to survive. And they can't even do that in Toronto anymore.
It's just been so horrific. I wasn't able to be there that day. I don't live in Toronto, but seeing all of the videos and photos coming through across my timeline, hearing about friends of mine who've been pepper sprayed and attacked and arrested even, was just horrific. And, it just goes to show, police serve one major role in our society, and that is the protection of private property. Whether it is attacking Indigenous land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory to force through the Coastal GasLink pipeline, or whether it's clearing out a so-called public park to film a TV show, the police are not on our side. Instead, we've got, as Daniel said, we're linking to amazing groups like ESN who are doing the work of supporting all of our neighbors, everyone in our community. We keep us safe.
And now just moving over from Toronto and Ontario, we're going back to British Columbia, where our correspondent, Yvonne Hansen, leading eco-socialist, former NDP candidate in the federal election back. When did she run again? Was it 2019?
Yeah, it was 2019.
For Vancouver Granville, I believe, right?
Yes, Jody Wilson-Raybould's riding.
Yes. So Yvonne now is providing us every month with updates on what's happening in British Columbia, the only province with an NDP government right now. You wouldn't be able to tell that based on how they're doing things over there. But we have some updates on wildfires. British Columbia is on fire, and none of this can be separated from all the work of people who are still active and putting their bodies on the line at Fairy Creek. As of July 25th, nearly 500 people have been arrested in total at the Fairy Creek blockade since they started demonstrating in May. And at least 28 of those individuals have now been arrested multiple times. Although last month we did cover that there is going to now be a 2-year moratorium on some old growth logging in that area, it does not protect everything. So these land defenders are not backing down. And the Fairy Creek blockade Instagram, which we will link below, reminds us that we are clear-cutting old growth forests at a rate of around 150,000 hectares per year in British Columbia. These blockaders will not stand down, and they still need our support. So all of that will be found below. But while we have people, protecting trees, we also have very, very compelling evidence of what happens when we don't protect the ecosystems around us.
I also want to add that if you are in British Columbia, if you can make your way down to the Fairy Creek blockade, if you are able and willing to put yourself on the line along with the other land defenders at Fairy Creek, please do so. They are in need of as much support as they can get. If you don't feel comfortable putting your body out there, which, fair enough, it is a risk of significant violence, as we have seen thanks to the Fairy Creek Instagram account, they are in need of supplies and support, be that monetary donations or other donations of supplies, food, camping equipment, etc. So please support the blockade however you can.
So just like Ontario, British Columbia is in the midst of a very early and very harsh fire season, which, living in Ontario, the concept of a fire season is more dystopian than I'm
very
used to.
Very unfamiliar to us.
But we missed this last month. We literally recorded, and then I got the news that Lytton burned down, which is a town in the interior of BC where the all-time Canada record for highest temperature ever was recorded. It hit 50 degrees Celsius during this historic heat wave. And as a result, when a passing train was braking to slow down, sparks caused the whole town to ignite in like 15 minutes. And 2 people died in that town. And that same fire that burnt Lytton to the ground, it's destroyed. It's still burning through the mountains of British Columbia. It is not yet extinguished.
Yeah, and there are many, many wildfires all across British Columbia and in the prairies, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and in northern Ontario. So a lot of the smoke that we've been experiencing down south and east in southern Ontario and across the Maritimes, a lot of that smoke has been blown through the jet stream from British Columbia, but also from northern Ontario. And the air quality has been significantly decreased. Toronto had very, very poor air quality a couple of days ago, and it's been very, very hazy, difficult to breathe. Lots of people all across this country have had very, very serious complications due to respiratory illnesses. And of course, as many people have been pointing out, this is also worsening the impacts of COVID, because when you have a respiratory infection and wildfire smoke, which is now, they're saying, is significantly more dangerous than previously expected, you have just a perfect storm for worsening COVID outcomes. Fortunately, our case rates are still low as vaccine uptake still continues to tick upwards, which is fantastic. But of course, for those who do get infected, for the vulnerable people for whom the vaccine does not offer complete protection, it is still a very, very serious thing to contend with. And it just goes to show that there is nowhere on this entire planet that is safe from the climate crisis.
Absolutely. And that's really the slogan we need to impart on people. An injury to one is an injury to all. And if you fully accept that saying, I mean, we're all at risk. And there are some areas that are incredibly threatened right now. This is not something that's affecting people 20 years into the future, but the people of Lytton, their entire town is gone. And we need to respond to this acute stuff with also the idea that we are literally all going to be facing down the same crisis. Some people a little bit sooner than others, but those photos of Toronto and the haze, they're terrifying. And yet I have a new genre of least liked editorial where people talk about how beautiful the sky has been looking in Toronto around sunset. You have these really red, beautiful sunsets, and you have the blog TO articles like, oh, these photos of Toronto are so stunning, and I'm just, would we be doing the same thing if it was a mushroom cloud on the horizon? Like, some things we inherently know, even if they're aesthetically beautiful, we know that it's destructive. And I think the fact that we're not treating this with the same urgency in the media is part of this manufactured consent around this continued destruction of the planet.
There was a resident of Lytton who was interviewed in the aftermath of the fires who he and his family had just barely escaped. But he observed that, we are a microcosm of the climate crisis. We are largely low income, high proportion of indigenous peoples living in and around the town. We are not wealthy and well-resourced, and we are a microcosm of what the climate crisis is going to look like. This is going to be most significant. This is going to have the most significant impacts on low-income people, indigenous people, rural people, folks who are less connected to emergency services. But even when you're living in a major metropolis like Vancouver, that does not guarantee that emergency services will be there when you need them. During the heat wave in British Columbia last month, emergency services were so overworked and so overextended that many 911 callers in Burnaby and Surrey, which are Metro Vancouver municipalities, they waited up to 3 hours for ambulances to arrive for people who were experiencing all kinds of emergencies, but especially related to heat stroke. It is absolutely chilling to know that as these temperatures rise, our emergency services are breaking down. There are several heartbreaking stories that have made headlines during this time, including one in which a family's grandmother collapsed and was unresponsive for 45 minutes while the family waited on hold with the 911 dispatcher. This is not to hold 911 and emergency services responsible. They were doing their best. Ambulance services and paramedics were trying very hard to get to everyone, but there were no additional resources provided to account for the depth and significance of the emergency. Many public health nurses and public health employees in British Columbia have gone on record to say not enough was done to warn people about how significant this heat wave could be. We knew it was going to be hot. We did not get enough information about how devastating and how deadly this heat could be and what to do when emergency services can't get to you because they are overwhelmed.
In total, 808 people died directly related to the heat wave across British Columbia in just 1 week's time. And as mentioned, a few people also died in the Lytton fire. And as more and more people continued to die, we already mentioned John Horgan's remarks last month, but what was it again? Fatalities are a part of life. This is what the NDP, the only NDP premier in Canada, can't even take a stance against climate change?
It's disgusting. We should also note that 808 number is likely to go up because there are still many deaths being investigated. There are people who had other medical complications, people with, as we said, respiratory infections or cancers or old age, heart conditions, and they are still being investigated by the coroner as to whether or not this was a, quote, anticipated, unquote, death, or whether or not it was an unanticipated death, meaning that it was directly precipitated by the heat wave. It's one of those things that's very difficult to tell. And of course, it's one of those things where one thing compounds on top of another, and it is not cut and dry whether or not things are directly linked one to the other.
In the early days of what is going to be 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees of global warming, we are already seeing such anomalies, such extreme weather, that you get something in like what we see in British Columbia. There's now a state of emergency in the province as of July 20th because of the over 250 fires burning across the province. You have mass evacuations, and you've had thousands of homes being evacuated, almost 5,000 homes being evacuated as of July 26th. And efforts to fight these fires, it's just BC is also in the middle of a drought. Some rivers are drying up in southern BC. And as much as Vancouver is kind of cast as this really rainy place, it's been a month and a half without any rain. And this is not expected to change anytime soon. So with all these wildfires threatening so many communities in the interior of BC, places that usually survive off of tourism and camping revenue, they're facing now another crisis. With the pandemic restrictions easing, cases are falling, many of these tourist-dependent businesses were expected to recoup something, at least. But now, again, for an entirely different catastrophe, they are once again left without any sort of income or ability to support these small towns. And with all the farm die-off that's occurring and this lack of tourists coming, especially from the States.
Mm-hmm. And along with the farm die-off, as you mentioned, it is worth noting that it is not just the west coast of Canada, but the entire west coast of North America that is facing these extreme heat and extreme drought conditions. California is in the midst of one of the worst droughts of its entire history, and Meech Lake, near the Hoover Dam, that provides water to thousands and thousands and thousands of people who live in and around California, Nevada, and Arizona, is now at its lowest level ever. It's genuinely terrifying. A vast majority of food is grown in California, and as well as a lot of agriculture that happens in British Columbia and across the prairies. So this has all kinds of impacts all over the world, from soaring food prices, which are already vastly increased during the pandemic, to more food scarcity.
The capitalist system is one that's very international. It's one that is running on bare bones as to maximize profit. We live in an austere society where all our public supports, like 911 dispatch and nurses and all of these essential services, are basically running on a skeleton crew all the time. And so it's really actually quite easy for me to imagine how these crises will just continue to get worse and worse, and the dominoes start falling, where you get a historic drought, and then you actually start getting food shortages.
Drought and food shortages was a direct contributor to the Arab Spring, when there was a historic drought in Russia and Northern Asia, where a large percentage of the world's wheat is grown. That drought decimated grain yields that year, which led to skyrocketing food prices and cost of living prices all across the Middle East, which relies massively on grain imports from these northern areas, which contributed to rampant dissatisfaction and frustration and anger within the general population, which led directly to the Arab Spring, the effects of which we are still dealing with, and the outbreak of civil war in Syria, of course, can be directly tied to this as well.
Welcome to our third Canadian Heritage Moment. On July 8th, BC's NDP government became the first province to sign up for $10 per day daycare, with the federal government contributing $3.2 billion over 5 years. A good step forward, you might think. However, Justin Trudeau is flaunting his pseudo-feminist credentials again on this initiative, along with Liberal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, who recently pledged $30 billion over 5 years for childcare across the country. We at Red Review, however, beg to differ with Trudeau and the federal Liberals on their interpretation. We are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers' 42-day strike in 1981, which won postal workers paid maternity leave. In our opinion, this was the pivotal moment for maternity leave in Canada, with an 84% strike vote in favor and 23,000 postal workers walking off the job in support of their sisters and siblings. Private business watched the strike closely, fearing that the CUPE precedent would cross over into the private sector. These brave postal workers, backed by the women's movement nationwide, won 17 weeks paid maternity leave with a benefit of 93 cents on every dollar. This then is the quintessential Canadian heritage moment that we at Red Review are celebrating.
So now at this point, this month is very heavy on the international side of things. We still want to cover Palestine, because from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And just because it's no longer very newsworthy to the CBC and others, we here want to keep that spotlight there. But we also are going to have to talk about Cuba and Haiti as well. Canada often has this benign appearance on the international scale. We're going to challenge that here today.
Yeah. We rely very heavily on our reputation of being nice and polite and kind, which covers a vast multitude of sins, as we discussed last month when we were talking about Canadian mining corporations. Despite the ceasefire in mid-May, the suffering of the Palestinian people has not ended. The destruction of the most recent Israeli aggression in Gaza remains devastating. Unexploded bombs are still being discovered on the streets. Rubble is still being cleared. Roads are still being rebuilt. And Gaza remains a humanitarian disaster. Across the entirety of historic Palestine, conditions remain atrocious, representing what B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, has described as apartheid. Examples of this apartheid are everywhere. Earlier this month, in a display of unnecessary cruelty, Israel denied the right of Palestinian MP and political prisoner Khalida Jarrar to attend her recently deceased daughter Suhag Hassan Jarrar's funeral. Another bizarre and somewhat barbaric incident came to light when the family of the prisoner Eyad Rebat discovered how he was treated in a completely inhumane and obscene manner, which included torture and the injection of unknown chemicals directly into his head, resulting in major physical and mental damage. The village of Al-Kabun in the West Bank was raided in the middle of the month, resulting in 11 families now facing homelessness and demonstrating the sustained Israeli effort to ethnically cleanse the entire region of Palestinians and a complete disregard for the Palestinian connection to the land. The State of Israel even had the gall to provide Jewish settlers entry into the Al-Aqsa compound during Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest days in Islam. Prisoners continue to be taken, lands continue to be stolen, rights continue to be abused, and the State of Israel faces no international repercussions.
What's more, this summary, who is provided by our correspondent and anti-Zionist Jew, Will Morris, who feels compelled to share this. And just as a preview, later this month, we will be releasing an interview with Aliyah of the GTA Palestine movement, who will also shed more insight and perspective into the apartheid and genocide that's continuing in Palestine. But this summary provided cannot even hope to capture a fraction of the total destruction and abuse that is occurring in Palestine. The examples of oppression are unending, and without our solidarity and support from inside Canada, from inside the belly of this imperialist beast, the oppression is likely to continue. Only the people in imperialist countries like Canada have the power to force the political elite to end their destructive international campaigns, and we must continue this project until Palestine is free. Not a single one of us is free until Palestine is free. But there are a few positive sides to the story that are worth noting. For one thing, the industrious people of Gaza, despite the odds, are managing to begin the process of rebuilding, which is currently estimated by the World Bank to cost $380 million just for the physical damages alone. The boycott, divest, and sanction movement has gained some traction, especially with Ben & Jerry's recently deciding to pull out of these illegal settlements in the West Bank. And prominent intellectual Cornel West publicly denounced Harvard over denying him tenure due to his insistence on voicing the Palestinian cause in his capacity as a professor. Moreover, international solidarity remains stronger than anticipated, with many demonstrations being carried out right here in Canada in support of the Palestinian cause, especially before the ceasefire, but they're continuing even through the month of July, despite the dearth of mainstream media coverage. Many prominent groups like the GTA Palestine movement and the Palestinian Youth Movement have managed to rally hundreds and sometimes thousands of people to attend events dedicated to the cause of Palestinian liberation. And with a federal election looming on the horizon, these forces should be mobilized to put Palestine on the federal agenda. Much of the critical work within the NDP has been achieved through the consistent efforts of the NDP Socialist Caucus and other left-wing elements within the party. But the issue needs to be sustained by activists, by organizers, both within the NDP and outside the NDP. We need to force our political elites to stop selling weapons to Israel. And we need to end all diplomatic and material support for the settler apartheid state.
It is worth noting that there is an ongoing effort by the Canadian Association of University Teachers to censure the University of Toronto. Dr. Azarova was slated to become the new head of the University of Toronto Law Program's Human Rights Program, but there were some objections to her hiring voiced by some prominent UofT donors, and as such, they rescinded the offer from her because of her activism related to Palestinian rights in Gaza and in the West Bank settlements.
The movement on campus for a while was a bit quiet because very quickly, any critics of what UofT did, they were going to be targeted as anti-Semites. So for a while, the students were pushed back. But even now, during the summer of a pandemic-stricken year, the Palestinian Students Association at UofT gathered in person, hosted a march and a rally with over 100 supporters in defense of the censure, calling for them to fix all the wrongs that the administration has done in this case, which is not only a violation of academic freedom, but beyond that, it further highlights our universities. And when I say our, I'm a University of Toronto student. At least for 10 more days, I will be finishing up finally my graduate student program just next week. So by the time you hear this, I will be finally free of that place. But not only are they not standing up for academic freedom, they're complicit in Israeli apartheid. They have investments in companies that are producing weapons for Israel, and they have exchange programs that are in occupied illegal settlements. UofT provides so much cover for Israel, and now students are finally calling BS on that and saying, we are the students, you represent us. And this is something you're gonna have to contend with. You can't just be silent on this anymore, because UofT's main strategy is just to wait out the students. It's very convenient for them that most student leaders arrive at that position when they're just about to graduate. So in their mind, UofT's like, we just need to wait one more year and then no harm, no foul.
It is also worth noting that the support for the censuring of the University of Toronto, so for those who don't know what a censure entails, a censure includes not inviting any University of Toronto faculty to speak at any events, not attending any events at the University of Toronto, not hiring University of Toronto graduates for particular programs. I know there are several law firms in Toronto who have said we will not be hiring any U of T law grads until the censure is over, and encouraging their membership not to accept any positions at the University of Toronto. And there are many, many high-profile academics who have spoken out in support of the censure, including David Suzuki, Leanne Simpson, Judith Butler, Bianca Wiley, Adi Opir, Craig Calhoun, and many, many others. You can find them on the Censure U Toronto Instagram account, which we will link below.
And just one final word regarding Palestine and anti-Semitism. As we all know, one of the most prominent attacks levied against pro-Palestinian activists is the charge of anti-Semitism. And I myself have been called, at least on one occasion, an anti-Semite for standing resolutely in defense of Palestinians. The claim is that the criticism of the state of Israel amounts to anti-Semitism. And this is in line with the definition being proposed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This very definition is being proposed for adoption at the federal level in Canada after a recent summit on anti-Semitism was held. But this needs to be both attacked with logic and data. Logic would dictate that criticism of any state cannot amount to criticism of the people within that state, since the two things are just not the same thing. And it's really only with Israel that ever are people then equating that with anti-Semitism. No one is saying that criticism of the Chinese government is xenophobic. People don't make that argument. This is reserved in the case of Israel. And recently, survey data is showing a striking change regarding Jewish public opinion in North America. It's only a tiny minority of Jews who report Israel playing an important role in their political lives. even despite a high level of attachment to Israel. And nearly 60% of those surveyed indicated the need for conditioning any and all aid to Israel such that it does not get allocated to these illegal settlements in the West Bank. And this is representative of a profound shift in thinking. 62% of surveyed Jews, they support aid for the Palestinians. What's more, 61% reported concern for anti-Semitism stemming from right-wing groups as opposed to pro-Palestinian or progressive movements. Generally speaking, the trend is that younger Jews are increasingly detached from Israel, with 41% of Jews under 40 expressing no attachment to Israel whatsoever. The most profound agreement was about the possibility of holding both pro-Israel views and views critical of the Israeli government simultaneously. 87% of people held this view. And what this data shows then is that critique of Israel is certainly acceptable even within the Jewish community, and that there are a wide range of opinions regarding the many dimensions on this issue. Yet, according to the IHRA, and soon maybe the Canadian federal government, these types of opinions, many of which are held by Jewish people, they're fundamentally anti-Semitic. But it's time that we attack this hyperbole and shift the general discourse back to reality. Critique of Israel is not anti-Semitic whatsoever. Jews themselves criticize Israel. Are we to believe that all these anti-Zionist Jews are actually anti-Semites? This preposterous idea is thankfully losing steam in public consciousness, but we must always remain vigilant against the very real threat of anti-Semitism as well, while acknowledging that the source of anti-Semitism is not Palestine.
It is also worth noting that a lot of groups that very loudly and vocally support Israel are right-wing groups, which often have deeply anti-Semitic membership. So clearly pro-Zionism and support for Jewish people are not interlinked by any means. You have highly anti-Semitic Republicans being deeply invested in Israel and very vocal in their support for Israel. And I might be able to shed some light as to why. I know many people I've talked to have been somewhat confused as to why on earth these right-wing evangelical Christians are so supportive of Israel when they are so clearly and explicitly anti-Semitic in all other areas. And part of it is a strange interpretation of biblical scripture, which believes that the return of Jesus, as foretold in the Gospels and in the New Testament, cannot come about until all of the Jewish people are returned to living in the Jewish homeland. It's this bizarre philosophical apocalyptic thinking that states that Jewish people should leave everywhere else in the world that they are living and return to Israel because that will precipitate the second coming of Christ, wherein, of course, Christian people shall be exalted and lifted up into the heavens, and all of the non-believers, guess who else that includes, shall be condemned to hell, which is just like, I wouldn't want those people on my side.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. If you're supportive of Israel, at some point you need to look around and see who else is shouting loudly alongside you, because a lot of the views that are going to get packaged in there are going to be not pro-Jewish at all, or even anti-Semitic. It's strictly pro-Zionism in a lot of these cases.
So clearly, this demonstrates that pro-Zionism and anti-Semitism can go hand in hand as well. Why do we need to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism? With this internationalist focus, of course, and all of this attention to protests around the world, we need to also turn our attention and our solidarity efforts towards Cuba.
It was again in the UN that the topic of the embargo and sanctions of Cuba, it was brought to a vote again. And only 2 countries remain in support of the economic blockade of this tiny Caribbean nation. And those 2 countries are, drumroll, the United States and Israel, of course, which is another reason why I think the right-wing demagogues in America, they see Israel as their ally in this. They prop up their government with aid so that in return, Israel can support all of the imperialist policies that America wants to enact, which includes fully breaking Cuba and reopening that country, that island, to American corporations for exploitation.
Protests in Cuba began on July 11th in many areas across the country. There has been a lot of discussion about what the people in Cuba are protesting for, but it's important to look at things in the broader context before we make any assumptions or draw any conclusions. To start off, we should look at recent developments in Cuba and their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. On November 26, 2020, the Cuban government reported that in the country of 11.5 million people, they had had only about 8,000 cases total, or only about 0.06% of their total population. On that same day, the US reported about 0.03% of their population had contracted COVID-19 that very day. This shouldn't be immensely surprising considering that Cuba has the third highest number of doctors per capita out of any country in the world. In fact, Cuba had done so well at this point in terms of their COVID response that they were able to send out doctors to 38 other countries across the globe to provide international support in this time of crisis. At the beginning of their pandemic, the government even began to repurpose factories to start making medical face masks in order to address the urgent need for face coverings. This isn't even mentioning the fact that Cuba developed 5 COVID vaccines on their own. So what could have happened here? Cuba seemed to be doing pretty well at this point. What went wrong?
So you can't talk about Cuba without talking about the economic blockade that is spearheaded by the United States. When the Batista dictatorship, which was actually first propped up by the United States, they're the ones that backed up the 1952 coup that led to the butcher Batista reigning over Cuba. When Castro and Che Guevara and the working people of Cuba finally overthrew Batista and also made it clear that they were going to expropriate the wealth of the American multinationals that were operating on the island and dominating it economically. Once that happened, Cuba made the biggest enemy that they could ever face in America, which is also geographically their closest neighbor. You have the tiny Caribbean nation that was at that point being choked by America. And this was all to quote, this was a plan. America wasn't doing this reaction simply because they cared about Cuban people. They cared only about the access to that economy for their own corporations. So the plan was to, quote, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government, end quote. This was America's plan. It was very explicit. They attempted to assassinate Castro dozens of times. They had the failed invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, and this embargo hasn't ended. It's been, honestly, I don't want to, maybe not the term miracle here, because ultimately it's the people of Cuba that are making it work, but that you've been able to resist for so long is a testament to the strength of the working class all around the world. And if Cuba, as such an impoverished, economically besieged country, can achieve a life expectancy that's equivalent to the United States, can so decrease maternal death and so increase literacy, despite having a GDP that's a fraction of Canada or the United States, just imagine what could happen if the working class ruled over the entire planet and all of this immense resources that we have. Just imagine how much suffering we could alleviate.
During the governance of United States President Barack Obama, he stated that the Cuban embargo had been going on for quite some time and was not serving the American interests as much as they'd hoped, instead opting for an approach that would involve loosening some restrictions and allow for greater presence of American businesses to slowly transform the country with economic rulings to bring in a more US-friendly government. However, Trump undid a lot of Obama's changes to loosen the restrictions on place in Cuban trade. Most severely, in his last 2 weeks in office, he added Cuba to the list of state-sponsored terrorists. This action made sanctions for businesses in Cuba much more severe and restricted foreign aid immensely, among other things. During the pandemic, Cubans aren't even able to access Zoom and many other virtual communication services as the embargo restricts a lot of these enterprises. This brings us up nearly to today. So that's the embargo. What then are the protests about? The Cuban economy and the Cuban people have been suffering immensely over the course of this pandemic. Even though in terms of case rates they've been doing well, their access to trade and their ability to farm and engage in industry has been seriously restricted. One of Cuba's largest sources of income is, of course, tourism, and this has all but halted due to travel restrictions related to COVID. The tourism sector doesn't just bring in money for Cubans, but it also brings in a specific type of valuable money. While Cuba is able to trade with other countries, as long as they are willing to risk never conducting business with the US again, the United States embargo makes it significantly more difficult to gain access to US currency, something which is needed for most international trade. One of the main sources of this currency in the past has been through tourist money flowing into the country, which can then be traded with other nations. Another source has traditionally been Cuban dollar stores. These are stores run by the Cuban government that accept American currency and act as a way to collect American dollars through Cubans who get that money sent to them by loved ones who are working in the United States. If this seems like an issue, it's worth noting how oversized of a role the United States has in the global economy and in people's lives. The lack of access to United States currency and the lack of money flowing into the country has resulted in extremely harsh conditions for Cuban people. This has also happened at a time when the Cuban government had merged their currencies and ended the dual currency system that had existed in the country since the fall of the USSR as a way of supporting the citizens by distinguishing between trade currency and currency within the country, effectively keeping the money within the domestic economy and thus keeping inflation under control. Unemployment has risen as a result of declining tourism, and food shortages continue to exist under the embargo and are exacerbated by the changes made by the Trump government. Although Cuba has developed their own vaccines, which have similar efficacies in clinical trials to Pfizer and Moderna, they are experiencing severe shortages of syringes. Being restricted from trade with their largest natural trading partner has just made everything more difficult to get. And while this is all happening and the Cuban people suffer, the United States government and the Biden administration are watching over them like vultures, waiting for the Cuban people to be sufficiently desperate to bring about severe political instability so that they can swoop in and reap the rewards of their ongoing cruel embargo. Let us remember what the Cuban people are suffering as a result, while the American media machine continues to manufacture consent, presenting a distorted image of the Cuban wants and needs that always involve some fringe anti-communists holding an American flag and chanting freedom. We need to keep in mind that there can be no freedom anywhere until basic needs are met. Basic needs cannot be met in Cuba at the present moment until the US retreats on its imperialist agenda, ends the embargo, and gets its hands off Cuba. And of course, this isn't to say we are endorsing all of the actions by the Cuban government or the Cuban military and police with regard to their treatment of protesters. But I think it is extremely important that we who are in the imperial core keep our focus on the direct material implications of the embargo and how Canada supports the United States in this embargo. Even though we do trade and we have less restrictions on interacting with Cuba, it is still critical that we maintain our criticism in the right place. There is little we can do to affect the Cuban government, but we can keep our attention on the very, very cruel and unjust economic policies that have led to these conditions.
And with that, this is the conclusion of the July review here at the Red Review, brought to you by Socialist Action Canada. Like always, if you appreciate the analysis here and you are looking for more ways to get involved in the class struggle and you wish to join a revolutionary movement that seeks to overthrow capitalism and all its modes of oppression, then we invite you to reach out to Socialist Action. You can find out more about us at socialistaction.ca. You can watch us on YouTube at Socialist Action Canada. All of our other links will be in the description below. But even though this is the end of our July review, we will be releasing one more episode that is dedicated to Haiti, where Emily and I, along with author and activist Eve Engler, who is also an expert in Canadian foreign policy, will be diving into Haiti and Canada's role in Haiti's exploitation. So until next month, solidarity and take care.